Well, good morning once more. Great to be with you this morning. Good morning, those of you joining us on YouTube. It's great to be with you as well. Just a few weeks ago, I had an experience I hadn't had in a long time, but it turned out to be every bit as unpleasant as I remember it. I was cruising along the freeway when out of the corner of my eye, something caught my attention in the rearview mirror. It was a good distance behind me, but it was the unmistakable flashing red and blue of a highway patrol officer's lights. And as you might imagine, almost immediately, I went from very relaxed, very, just cruising, to very anxious and very worried and wondering what happened. I immediately started to ask myself questions. Things like, how fast am I going? Did I just change lanes and not use a blinker? Why did I get the darker tint on my truck windows? And maybe most specifically, is he really after me? Because here's the thing. Even though he was the car directly behind me, he was like a good ways behind me. And so there was a tiny sliver in the, thought in the back of my mind that maybe it's not actually me he's after. Maybe he's after someone else, like further on up the road, and he just wants me to get out of the way. So the issue was, though, he was closing fast. So I did pretty much the only thing I could do. I turned on, my blinker, and I got over into the right lane and just sat there anxiously waiting to see whether or not he would follow or whether he would just go by. And as, again, you can imagine, for about 3 seconds, time seemed to slow down and go, extra slow until, thanks be to God, it became apparent that he was going on by. He did not follow me over. He went on by up the road, lights flashing, sirens wailing, leaving me and my recently through the ceiling heart rate to continue on my merry way. Now, like I said, this was not a super, experience that I enjoyed, even though it only lasted probably 25 seconds. But as I reflect on it, I really doubt that it's all that unique. Because I'm guessing most of us here today have probably had an experience either exactly like this, or you've been in some sort of situation where you at least found yourself in a similar position. Some circumstance where your stomach dropped, your heart rate rose, and your adrenaline started pumping because you thought you might be in trouble. You might be busted. You might be wrong. You might be in for a reckoning, so to speak. Meaning, at the very least, what we all know and what we can all relate to is just how uncomfortable this feeling is. But unfortunately, this also means I might have some bad news regarding the rest of our time together this morning. Because today, as we continue to sort of inch our way towards the conclusion of the Sermon on the Mount, we come to a collection of verses which I believe should probably trigger this exact same feeling. That is, if we understand and we hear the words of Jesus and the warning that he's giving us in this passage, we can't help but get a very similar feeling to the one I just described. One where we look up and we think, oh no, is he talking about me? Does he have me in mind? Could I be the one that he's referring to? Because if there was ever a biblical equivalent of flashing lights in the rearview mirror, it has to be the statement Jesus makes in verse 21 of Matthew 7, where he looks to his disciples and he warns them, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven, which is a statement that absolutely has to grab our attention. And it has to grab our attention because from the very beginning of our series, through this 3-chapter-long sermon Jesus preaches here in Matthew, entering the kingdom of heaven has been the goal. It's what this has all been about. In a lot of ways, the kingdom of heaven has been the driving thing, the driving thought behind everything we have discussed so far. From what this kingdom is like, to how it interacts with the world, to what its citizens ought to be like. All the way through, we have seen this theme, even up to the passage we discussed last week. And now here, just 15 verses from the end of the sermon, Jesus is going to instruct us about how we can enter this very kingdom he's been describing. But he's going to do so in a very uncomfortable way, at least for us. Because between here and the end of the sermon, Jesus is going to give us 4 sets of warnings. 4 sort of pairs of warnings, 3 of which we'll look at today, and 1 of which we'll conclude our series with next week. And each one of these warnings is going to function a little bit like a street sign on the freeway of the Christian life, if you will. Almost as if Jesus is saying, hey, if you pay attention to these signs and you listen to the warnings I'm giving you, then you can be sure you will arrive safe and sound at the place I have been describing. But if you don't watch where you're going or you don't listen to the things I say, then don't be surprised when you end up somewhere other than you thought you'd be and end up in the wrong destination. Which, let's be honest, for many of us here today, the destination we think we're headed for is the kingdom of heaven. Is it not? I mean, that's the road we think we're on, meaning the warnings Jesus offers in this passage are critical for every single one of us, myself included, all of us, because we're the target audience, so to speak. So what we're going to do this morning is look closely at the 3 warnings Jesus gives us in this passage. 3 things he tells us to beware of so that we might never find ourselves in a situation like the one he describes in verse 23, standing before him only to hear him say, I never knew you. Depart from me, you lawbreakers. Which yet again is a statement and a verse that absolutely has to grab our attention. So in order to understand these warnings, let's go back to the beginning of our passage where the first thing we see Jesus tell us to do is to beware of the road. Beware of the road. And this is really important because from the very beginning, when Jesus starts to talk about entering the kingdom of heaven or going towards the kingdom of heaven, the very first thing he wants to warn us of, to tell us to be wary of, is the path we take to get there. Because it turns out not all paths are the same, and not every path has the same destination. We see this beginning in verses 13 and 14, where we read, enter through the narrow gate. For the gate is wide and the road broad that leads to destruction, and there are many who go through it. How narrow is the gate and difficult the road that leads to life, and few find it. You might remember last week I pointed out that over the course of the Sermon on the Mount, we've seen Jesus use some really creative illustrations, really kind of elaborate, ones that are almost comical to picture in our mind, kind of almost cartoonish in what they illustrate. But this is actually not the case in the illustration that Jesus uses here in verses 13 and 14. Because as Jesus' audience well knew, most cities in the ancient world had only a handful of access points. Like the city of Jerusalem, for example, where even to this day, several gates still stand, some dating back to the time of Jesus and even beyond. But if we could somehow go to Jerusalem, that would be cool for one thing, but if we could somehow snap our fingers and be there, or better yet, rewind the clock and visit during Jesus' life, in the time of Jesus and his disciples, one thing we would immediately notice is just how different all these gates are. Some, for example, are quite broad. They're quite wide, enough for many of us to come in and out, maybe leading animals or pushing carts all at the same time. Others, though, this is not so much the case. Others, using them is no small task. You might have to stand in line, sometimes for quite a while. You might, only 1 or 2 people might be able to squeeze through at a time. And in some ways, you might have to kind of fight your way through, maybe. Think leaving a large sporting event or large concert. And Jesus' audience would have been well aware of this, because this is something they had experienced often. But unfortunately for us, outside of maybe LA traffic, or like I said, some huge sporting event or concert, this isn't always something that we experience. And so sometimes the full depth of the warning Jesus is offering us here is lost on us, and it shows. Because specifically what Jesus is challenging in these verses is the notion that entrance or access to the kingdom of heaven comes easily. That's actually what the Greek word for broad in verse 13 means, literally prosperous or easy. Well, the word for narrow in verse 14 is often associated with being difficult or hard. And this is an idea we see echoed later on in the New Testament. In the book of Acts, when Luke tells us that Paul and his companions preached to the believers in Antioch, strengthening the disciples by encouraging them to continue in the faith and by telling them, note this, it is necessary to go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God. In other words, Scripture repeatedly warns us that we cannot simply go with the flow and end up in the kingdom of heaven. Rather, it requires effort. It requires paying attention and making certain choices. Years ago, while I was an undergrad at Azusa Pacific University, I would periodically drive home from roughly the Pasadena area where the school is located back to here in Bakersfield where I grew up. And all in all, on the whole, it's a pretty easy drive. But there's one spot, and if you're familiar with the 210 freeway through Pasadena, you're going to know the spot I'm referring to. But there's one spot on the freeway right about downtown Pasadena where the freeway suddenly switches. For no apparent reason, you suddenly go, with very little warning, you suddenly go from the 210 to the 134. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking I'm exaggerating, and in reality, this is like a 6-lane freeway where 3 go one way and 3 go another, and there's no excuse for missing it. That's not what happens, okay? Instead, the whole freeway becomes the 134, and the 210 is this tiny single-lane exit over here on the side that looks like a side street. And so you can go in an instant, if you're not paying attention, you can go from on the 210 headed home to on the 134 headed to Ventura. And it's kind of embarrassing to admit this, but I cannot tell you how many times I have been cruising along only to wake up miles later and realize I was headed in a completely opposite direction from the one I thought I was going on. In fact, it's happened so many times that to this day, when I drive that stretch of the 210, I never actually leave the slow lane for fear of missing my exit. I just stay put there now to be safe. But this, my friends, is very similar to what Jesus is trying to warn us of. That specifically, it's a certain kind of almost approach to the Christian life. Because the scary reality is far too many of us claim to be following Jesus, when the truth is we're just going with the flow of traffic. We're not actually thinking about the path we're on. And a great example of this is claiming to follow Jesus, but then only doing so when it's convenient or when it already kind of aligns with what we want. So to be even more specific and to use some phrases right here from the Sermon on the Mount, we'll follow Jesus until he says, turn the other cheek. And then we'll go, that can't mean that. Must mean something else. I'm not sure what, but that can't mean that. Or we'll follow Jesus until he says, whoever looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And we'll go, okay, let's be honest though. Who's that? Who's this really hurting? Or we'll follow Jesus until he says, don't worry about your life. Then we'll go, that's not possible. It's got to mean something else. We'll follow Jesus until he says, love your enemies. And then we'll argue, that doesn't include people that didn't vote like us. You see, when Jesus goes there, all of a sudden we want off the ride. Because following him any further would be painful. It would be difficult. And so all of a sudden we go, I don't know. I'm not sure. But really, this is something we should have known all along. I mean, after all, it was Jesus himself who said, if anyone wants to follow me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life because of me will find it. It's just another way of saying strive to enter through the narrow gate. And be wary of the road you're on as you seek the kingdom of heaven. This is the first one of the 3 warnings Jesus gives us in this passage. And as he continues in Matthew 7, we're going to see the second, where he further instructs us to beware of the results. First, beware of the road, and then second, beware of the results. This is what Jesus turns his attention to in verses 15 and following, where he says, "Be on your guard against false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravaging wolves. You'll recognize them by their fruit. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? In the same way, every good tree produces good fruit, but every bad tree produces bad fruit. A good tree cannot produce good fruit, neither can a bad tree produce good fruit. Every tree that doesn't produce good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. So you'll recognize them by their fruit." Now, broadly speaking, this is a warning against false prophets. And in ancient Israel, false prophets are anyone who claims to be speaking for God when the reality is they're not. And the dangerous implication here is that if you follow a false prophet, you will end up on the wrong path. You'll end up on the wrong road, following something that you think is true, when in reality it turns out to be false. And this makes sense. However, what we also have to acknowledge as we look at this verse is how false prophets present something of a unique problem for us as the church, both in the time of Jesus and even today, specifically in how they appear. Because they tend to appear very reasonable, very nice, very, very trustworthy, when in fact they're not. And this is what Jesus means when he says no wolf, for example, is going to show you his teeth and claws if he can dress up as a harmless sheep. Something which, according to Jesus, is precisely what false prophets do. But here in these verses, Jesus proposes a method of detection. Simply put, look at their lives. Think of it like a tree, he says. Can you see healthy fruit on this tree? Can you see people being genuinely nourished by it? In other words, what is it producing? And at a glance, this seems like really good, solid advice. The way to know the truth about someone speaking for God is to look at their lives. Absolutely. But the true challenge of this warning, and actually all 3 that Jesus gives us in this passage, is the stark contrast they present. Because think about it, when we look back over the words of Jesus in these verses, the one thing we cannot help but notice is just how black and white they are, right? I mean, let's think about this. You're either on the road to life or you're on the road to destruction. No in between. You're either producing good fruit or you're producing bad fruit. And Jesus doesn't stop there. Instead, he actually, later on in the Gospel of Luke, he actually makes this distinction even more stark, where he says in Luke 6, a good person produces good out of the good stored up in his heart. An evil person produces evil out of the evil stored up in his heart. For his mouth speaks from the overflow of the heart. Or as early church father St. Augustine once paraphrased, a bad person cannot perform good works, nor can a good person perform bad works. And I really think the reason this is such a challenge for us is because we live in a world of gray. Do we not? We live in a world of gray. We live in a world that loves to justify, to argue over, well, what's the lesser of two evils? Or how much can I get away with before technically crossing the line? That's what our world loves to do. And yet Jesus comes along and says, never mind all that. What are the results? What's the fruit? And the issue here, really, is the issue that anything Jesus says about false prophets he can also say to us. That's sort of the catch, right? Any standard he applies to them, he can also apply to us. Because we too bear fruit. Therefore, we too can be judged by our fruit. And all of a sudden, I'm not sure about you, but for me personally, I feel a little uncomfortable. Because earthly logic says, hey, I may not be perfect. Sure, there's a few things over here on the side I'm sure God doesn't love, but I'm working on those. All in all, right? All in all, I'm doing okay. When I think about everything, yeah, okay, of course there's some bad fruit, but all together, I'm trying, I'm doing the work. That's what earthly logic says, because truly evaluating the results of our lives and the fruit we're bearing is painful for all of us. And this is precisely why it's so tempting to read these verses and just sort of take it for granted that they must not actually be talking about us. It's sort of like seeing the lights in the rearview mirror and thinking, I must be somebody else. Can't possibly be me. That's sort of it's the easiest response to these verses. When instead, the true question we need to be asking ourselves is, am I really being obedient to what God has called me to? Am I really actually living the character of the kingdom as Jesus describes it here in the Sermon on the Mount? Or am I just saying one thing, or my lips saying one thing, when my life, my actions, the results of my life, the fruit that I'm bearing, say something completely else? Because in the final verses of our passage, Jesus warns of the outcome that awaits such people. And it's not pretty. He says in verse 21, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, didn't we prophesy in your name, drive out demons in your name, and do many miracles in your name? Then I will announce to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you lawbreakers. And in these verses, we find the final warning Jesus has for us. First, he said, beware of the road, then beware of the results, and now finally, beware of the relationship. Beware of the relationship we have with him. Here in these closing verses, we see Christ's focus shift from the here and now to the future day of judgment. A day when you and I will stand before him, anxious to justify, ready to explain with our list of excuses, when only one question will actually matter. Did we know him? Did we have a relationship with him? Some that day, Jesus warns, will have done remarkable things in his name. Driven out demons, prophesied, performed miracles, all with one rather major catch. They didn't know him, which is a stark reminder for us that mighty deeds are not the final indication of whether or not someone really belongs to Jesus. The only thing which will truly count on that day will be knowing him, or perhaps more specifically, being known by him. Earlier on, just a few minutes ago, I mentioned that I went to Azusa Pacific, and the truth is I loved it. It was a great time. I met my wife there, a lot of great lifelong friends. But there was one thing about it that always made me nervous. There was one thing I really didn't like, and it was this expectation of a ring by spring. Now, some of you, those of you that chuckled, know that there is if you're familiar with Christian universities, Christian colleges, or sometimes like long-term Christian summer camps, there is this expectation held by largely female students to be engaged by the second semester. To be engaged by, and the thought is that having found a good Christian man the first week of school, you will be engaged and well on the road to marriage a few weeks later by the start of the second spring semester. Now, this is a real thing. If you don't believe me, you go find someone, not me, that went to a Christian college, and they will back me up. I promise this is a real thing. But as a male student, this means you have to be really, really careful. Because even if you look like me, even inviting a female classmate to, let's say, get a cup of coffee can land you in a conversation that most of the students at APU refer to as a DTR, which stands for Define the Relationship. Don't ask about all the acronyms. It's silly. And in this conversation, you will be asked to define, in no uncertain terms, precisely how you feel for this person, how much you love this person, and how soon you are planning on proposing to this person. Now, let me just acknowledge, in some contexts, like in the real world, I understand that there's probably a place for conversations like these, okay? I understand that. But in a lot of cases, given the expectation of a ring by spring, these conversations were oftentimes being initiated before anyone had even gone on a date, for example. And so it was very frustrating, even for me. But I bring this up because in a very kind of weird way, the final verses of this passage are a little bit like Jesus asking us to define the relationship. Almost forcing us, even if we don't want to critically examine the real nature of the relationship we have with him. And worse still, the measuring stick he asks us to use is that of genuine obedience. In other words, we can say we know him if we do the will of his Father. This is very similar to what Jesus tells his disciples in Luke 6, verse 46, where he tells his disciples, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord?" Or he asks them, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and don't do the things I say?" Because regardless of what we claim, the true standard of being known by Christ is doing the things he says, being obedient to his word. Plain and simple, that's it. But this is a pretty terrifying thought, is it not? Because I think most of us would admit this is not a standard we come close to hitting. This is not a standard we come even close to, and yet this is the warning Jesus is giving. This is what it takes to enter the kingdom of heaven. Meaning we almost can't conclude without asking, so where do we go from here? I mean, how is this going to happen? How are we going to stay on the right road, bear the right fruit, and have the right relationship? These warnings seem very necessary, but they also seem kind of impossible, at least if the past is any indication of the future. Because the truth is, left up to our own, left to navigate on our own, none of these things are possible. None of these things are going to happen. We aren't going to heed the warnings. We're not going to be able to do any of the things Jesus says. And don't misunderstand me. That doesn't mean we can't or we shouldn't strive to do so. We absolutely should. But we've also got to be realistic about our own capabilities. Which means there's really just one place these warnings should drive us. They should drive us to the one who says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." And if you think about it, this is another very black and white statement, is it not? A statement the world doesn't like because of how exclusionary it is. But for those of us who know Jesus, we know it's the truth. We know he is the embodiment of everything we need. He is the way, the truth, and the life. He does fulfill the law and the prophets, guiding us toward this heavenly kingdom. Because it's only through his work on the cross that this narrow path is available. This is the message of our passage this morning. And perhaps never a more timely one at that. Because, for example, regardless of whether or not your candidate won this week, regardless of whether or not those tests came back with good news, regardless of whether or not you're feeling very confident or very optimistic about the future, regardless, Jesus is calling us today, calling us to choose right now, to carefully consider the road that we're on, the fruit of our lives, and by far the most important relationship any of us will ever have. In other words, the warning has been given. The day approaches, and how will the Lord find you when he returns? Would you pray with me? Almighty God, forgive us for all the ways we seek out that which only serves to harm us. Father, would you fill us with your Spirit? Would you give us eyes to see the path? Would you work in our hearts that we might bear fruit? And would you grow and strengthen our relationship with you? Left to our own devices, Lord, we cannot do this. But we are confident and we are hopeful because we know the way, the truth, and the life. We thank you, we praise you, we ask all these things in your holy and precious name. Amen.